So here we are at the Goodwood Motor Circuit. This place just oozes nostalgia with its period pit buildings, the flags and the signage. We're here though to have a lot of fun today because we're going to drive two iconic British cars, the Jaguar E Type and the Aston Martin DB5. So, first up, the Aston Martin DB5. Now I could tell you that the Aston Martin DB5 was built between 1963 and 65 at its Newport Pagnell factory, and that it has an all-aluminium 4-litre engine producing around 300 brake horsepower, and that the later models had a 5-speed gearbox and it had disc brakes, and that there were 123 convertibles made, and there was even a prototype shooting brake made for David Brown himself. David Brown, of course, being the DB in the name DB5. But all those facts were not true of the car I was driving. The car I was driving was an odd hybrid of Jaguar running gear and a mostly fiberglass body in the style of the Aston Martin DB5. I'm not sure which Jaguar the body was put on, but I suspect it was something like an XJS. And it was at this point I realised that the company hosting the track day, Everyman Racing, and I guess the clue is in the name, was pitching itself at the family fun level of the track day experience, as opposed to pitching it for anyone with prior race or even track experience. So, as you can see, we weren't allowed to drive the cars alone. There was an instructor sitting in the passenger seat, and even the long, fast Goodwood straights were broken up with temporary chicanes, i.e. cones. So it all took a bit of getting used to, and it wasn't what I quite expected. But hey, it was a summer's day and we were driving around Goodwood, so really there was nothing to complain about. But how close my experience was to driving an original DB5, I can't tell you. The steering, I have to say, was noticeable for its incredible lightness. It really did respond to a fingertip touch. This car did have power steering, which some of the original DB5s do have. It certainly didn't feel particularly powerful, but it did want to drift through the corners, so you had this sort of odd sensation of not going very quickly, but managing to achieve a smile-inducing drift through the corners. It certainly felt like a grand touring car as opposed to a race car tamed for the road. And it did seem a well-balanced car. But as I said, how much of that is a true reflection of the original DB5, I'm not sure. This is, of course, the part of the track where Stirling Moss had his infamous career-ending shunt whilst he was driving a rather flimsy Lotus back in 1962. It was actually just before this corner, and he was coming up behind Graham Hill to unlap himself in the Glover Trophy, and he went straight on into the bank and ended up in a coma for quite a long period of time. He could never explain what happened, and it was always seen as a bit of a mystery. So Everyman Racing runs these classics as they come under the banner of movie cars, and of course the DB5, known by some as the most famous car in the world, is the James Bond car. It was first seen in the Goldfinger film in 1964. There were actually 4 original cars used in the filming process, and one was auctioned in 2019 for $6.4 million. A non-Bond Aston DB5 is probably worth at the moment in the region of £600,000. There were only 300 made, so there's not many of them, and I'm pretty sure though that the car that I was driving was not worth nearly as much as that. But fiberglass or not, that shape is just beautiful. Then onto the Jaguar E Type, and I'm happy to say this is an original 1969 Jaguar E Type. The E Type was built between 1961 and 1974, and it is of course believed that Enzo Ferrari described it as the most beautiful car in the world. And looking at this model, you can see why. The convertibles seem to attract the big money at auctions, but for me, the coupe is the more attractive. Sadly, I found that this one was an automatic, but still I was going to relish taking this example of the timeless British classic onto the historic Goodwood Circuit. I have to say, these classics really do earn their keep. This poor E-Type had been driven hard since 9 o'clock in the morning, and it was about 3:30 by the time I got into it. The disc brakes were burning hot and smoking, and I couldn't help but notice that the temperature gauge was unnervingly high. But my instructor, Toby, who is a really nice guy, I have to say, confidently reassured me that once we were up and running, that temperature would come down, which I have to say it did. Now, I had opted to buy my in-car footage, which cost me £40 for the 3 cars I was driving, and they give you an SD disc at the end of the day with all the recordings on it. Sadly, it seems that mine had recorded pictures but no sound, and as you can see, the graphics weren't responding to the inputs. But I will say that it was all a very rewarding, fun experience driving this E-Type at Goodwood. Compared to the Aston, yes, it was heavier in the steering department, but it just felt totally planted on the road, and it inspired such confidence. That long louved bonnet stretched out in front of you, but you could plant it with pinpoint accuracy on the apex of the corner. When you fed the power on, it just inspired such confidence, egging you on to push it further. But unfortunately, the cones would come up and impede your progress. Of course, for me, the most desirable of the E-Types are the original racing lightweights. 18 were planned to be built, but only 12 were built in period, and each one was weighing less than 1,000 kilograms. They had the 3.8 engine, but in actual fact, it didn't do particularly well in period. But the E-Type was never designed to be a racing car. It was always going to be a road car. So there had to be quite a lot of development to make it competitive. And it often lost out to the beautiful Ferrari 250 GTOs. Jaguar, of course, used the chassis numbers of those missing 6 lightweights to build the continuation cars a few years ago. And they were built using the tools that were only available in the 60s and only the materials that were available to Jaguar in the 60s. So they were meticulously built, and of course their price tag of something like £1.2 million reflected that. But yes, driving an E-Type around Goodwood, we've seen them drifting at the revival meetings and at the front of the pack, fighting with the Cobras. So to be in the driving seat, going around these famous corners, was just a wonderful experience. So my third car was meant to be the iconic Ford GT40, or at least Everyman Racing's version of it. But unfortunately, its 7-litre V8 had given up the ghost earlier on in the day. So instead, I went for something completely different, the Aston Martin DB11. And I'm so pleased that I did. Only a year old, it's Aston Martin's flagship GT, powered by a Mercedes-AMG 5.2-litre V12 engine with twin turbochargers. The performance of this thing was really quite incredible and so different to anything I'd driven before.
A little bit of power for me now, start to feed her on, keeping it building, a little bit more power, keeping it building. On your power now, all the way if you need, keep it going, keeping it going, up a gear, keeping it building, keeping it going, off the throttle, no brakes, start nice and wide, speed's perfect.
Capable of a top speed of 203 miles per hour, and a 0 to 60 time of 3.6 seconds, I just couldn't stop smiling whilst driving it.
Throttle, onto your brakes, down again. Good man. Right, power now and overtake. Keep it going. Good. Off the throttle, firm brakes, down again. Hold that pressure. Off the brakes, no power, get her in. little bit of throttle, feed it wide. Up a gear if you can, Duncan. Good. Keeping it building, keep it going. Into the inside, good. Power now. Up a gear. Good man. Keep it going. Keep it going. Keeping it going. Off the throttle, wait for it.
The acceleration was exhilarating, helped of course by the paddle shift gear change, which was nearly instantaneous.
All the way now. Keep it going. Up a gear. Good. Off the throttle. Onto your brakes. Down one. Keep it on them. And off the brakes. Start nice and wide. Good. And off the throttle. Tuck in. Good. Power now out. Keeping it going. Off the throttle. Stay behind. Stay behind. Down a gear.
It wasn't only the speed that was so impressive though, it was also how quickly it could shed that speed. Just mind-blowing.
Keep it going.
The car felt enormous compared to the E-Type earlier and even the Aston Martin DB5.
Up again. Keep it going. Nearly. Off the throttle, good. And onto your brakes, down a gear. Good, we'll come off the brakes, to the right, power now for me. It's incredible, that acceleration. Up a gear, it does pick up so well. Off the throttle, onto the brakes, down one.
Driving it, there was certainly minimal body roll and it was so accurate with the steering. You could hit the apex every time. In actual fact, I was probably hitting the apex early because it was so responsive and I had to get used to that instantaneous reaction from the car after driving the DB5 and the E-Type.
That was exhilarating. It's nicely driven, mate.
It was all a really engaging experience and completely thrilling, and I could have gone on all afternoon driving that car around the circuit. So what a great day that was, driving around the Goodwood Circuit in an Aston and in a Jag. The Jag was a highlight for me, and it was actually quite interesting having the comparison to the modern Aston Martin, which the response and the speed of that car was phenomenal. But the looks and just the driving experience in this E-Type was just wonderful. So it's on my shopping list. Just before you go, do please take a moment to visit the new Historic Sports Car Collection website. You'll find the latest classic cars we've got for sale with their detailed descriptions and prices. Also, under our market picks, you can see what tempting classics are available elsewhere on the market and coming up for auction. We also have an extensive collection of automobilia and collectibles which are up for sale, and you can access those through the website. The blog will tell you where we've been and what we've been up to with event reports and videos. So you will find all this and more at the Historic Sports Car Collection website, which is www.historicsportscarcollection.co.uk.